mob. Woo! Well, hello, very beautiful community. It's almost 2023. It's been extraordinary to be on this journey together with you. This is a very quick catch up for us to just say hi and answer a couple of questions about Crimea that came before and during and after the Crimea episode we shared on the main channel. It's been very moving and a real privilege for me to be connected with you over the past few months. I feel our conversation is just beginning. Sometimes on my side there are significant physical challenges, and that's why I've been absent for the last 7 days from here, from the chat channel. But I always believe in saying, look, even if there are limits that seem fixed, there are always possibilities to explore what's possible and to discover that more is possible than you thought. Now, what we're going to talk about very soon is the war in 2023, where we're at, what to expect. And the big panorama there is that Mr. Putin has lost the war, but it's still an open question what will happen on the Ukrainian frontier of that war. I think that things may not look optimistic for Putin on that frontier, but wars are uncertain, and it's clear that whatever happens over the next few months in Ukraine, this is an escalation, this is a conflict that Mr. Putin has already lost. What we're waiting for is the details to be filled out, and everybody in Ukraine is in our thoughts today. So, Slava Ukraini. Was the annexation of Crimea inevitable? Well, nothing is inevitable, of course. So these are questions that have come in that I found repeating themselves at least twice in emails, in DMs. Nothing is inevitable, but when Putin says that Ukraine is Russia, it was never his idea that this should be expressed in the Soviet way. In other words, that Ukraine should be part of the same country as Russia. What he means by that is that Ukraine is Russia, and it can perfectly well be a separate country, but it cannot have an independent politics. So it's got to have some kind of a puppet there. And unless there's a puppet there that's fairly accountable to Moscow, fairly well accountable to Moscow, then Mr. Putin is going to be deeply threatened by that situation. So as soon as it felt Ukraine was drifting away and Putin was staying in power, you were beginning to get worried about something happening with Ukraine. But because the larger agenda is Putin escalating against the West, it's possible that he may have started elsewhere in the Baltics and not in Ukraine. So Crimea happened because Putin felt that there was an opportunity there and he took advantage. And I think that one of the problems there was that Putin underestimated how far he got lucky in 2014, with Ukraine being in a political crisis, with Ukraine not having a military, with there being extensive and quite successful permeation of Russian interests, Russian lobbying in Ukraine, lots of pro-Russian political activism and media in southeastern Ukraine. So Putin took that less as luck and more as him making his luck, which over-encouraged him to be prematurely and destructively entrepreneurial in his ventures from then on. So inevitable, no, but something with Ukraine was always in danger of happening as soon as Ukraine began to drift toward democracy and independence. Lots of people have asked a question that I think isn't right to answer right now, which is how do people in Crimea feel? This is a complex question. But here is something I'd always throw into any kind of demographic assessment. And you know how it's going to look, you know how many Russians have come into Crimea since the 14th annexation. But what I would say is that even for the Russian sympathizing folks, once you debrainwash yourself a bit from the propaganda, it's a no-brainer whether you want to be in Ukraine or Russia. It's a no-brainer. Just at the level of life opportunities. I mean, you're going from the country with the worst level of soft power of anybody you can imagine to a country with the greatest amount of punch above one's weight, soft power. How do you make a territorial acquisition legitimate? So, what you don't want to do is you don't want to be married to one person on a Tuesday and then married to another person on a Wednesday. So even if Crimea wasn't joining Russia but was joining Sweden, and if Crimea was joining Sweden without Sweden sending in little green men, without a fake referendum, without any kind of political manipulation and permeation, even without any encouragement, even if folks in Crimea mobilized and expressed a particular idea that they wanted to join Sweden, I wouldn't have been happy with that. That wouldn't have been acceptable to me, because as a political philosopher, the picture of legitimacy that I'm looking for is really going to be a two-step rather than a one-step picture. You're going to have to create a political movement towards secession and independence first. Once you are stably seceded and independent, if you get there, you can look at who you might want to join and not join, and then you could think about joining Sweden. So on top of all the other illegal and illegitimate things that we have with Putin's theft of Crimea, you also have this situation where you just don't get to join other countries in that single step. That isn't ever going to be a story that makes sense. You've got to take a few weeks break. Even if you're going to join Sweden, you're going to take a few weeks break, and you're going to be married to the same person in the same week. Do you still believe the USA is cautious about Ukraine taking Crimea? The politics of the United States, forgetting the military analysis for a while and just abstracting it away, roughly says at the moment, we're going to give Ukraine a shot of getting close to returning to something like the Feb 2022 balance. Maybe more. But we're going to give Ukraine a shot of it being doable. We're not going to set up Ukraine to definitely do it. So that's an important distinction. So the level of support that I recognize at the moment is not commensurate with a definitive position of return of all territories going back to 1991. It's not even clear that it's compatible with the return of all territories going back to February 2022. It's compatible with putting Ukraine in with a good shot. So if you felt that that wasn't enough, and I think there's a strong case for that, then you could then develop that conversation further. What was Russian sentiment in Crimea before the annexation? I think the thing to say is that if you think of how political change happens and how economic change happens, cultural change is more slow. You know, when a certain kind of cultural myth, the kind of cultural myth that I was trying to very schematically paint for you in the video on the main channel, that in case you haven't seen, I'll put it up at the end of this one. That stuff, even when you kind of rationally give up on it, remains part of your subconscious at the level of imagery, you know? And that's often how, for example, prejudices work. too. So if I am prejudiced against the capacity of women to function in a certain professional environment, at least as effectively as men, it might be that I say, oh, hang on. Women make politicians at least as good as men. That's my belief. But you see, at the level of imagery, I might still have imagery in my mind, which makes me feel that, yes, I'm looking at a female politician and somehow she just lacks some kind of a gravitas. And the men have it, but she doesn't. And so my beliefs are in order, but my images aren't in order. So it's a very complex process of fragmentation. When I lived in Tonga, an acquaintance of mine was killed by a tiger shark. And the locals blamed her for it because they felt, look, only morally bad people get killed at sea. And I had some guests at the time, and other folks had some guests from Western countries who happened to be involved in marine biology, and they felt, no. I mean, sharks don't behave in a way that's sensitive to the moral properties of humans. Come on. And the locals began to say, yeah, all right. I mean, these people know about sharks. They say they're sort of morally neutral. So therefore, could have been a brutally contingent disaster that this kid in their mid-20s got taken, And however, then a few weeks after Tessa was killed, a boy from a neighboring village was taken out to sea by a rip and drowned, and then that moral story returned. And the distinction was now, well, if outsiders drown at sea or get killed at sea, it's a contingent disaster, it's an accident. But if locals get killed, it's still because of some kind of moral failure. So this is an example of a local mythology about the sea fragmenting but not going away. And so that Crimean myth that I'm painting isn't something that Russians are going to read propositionally and say, oh yeah, tick to this, tick to that. But it somehow still frames their consciousness. So what I would say is, if you go back before 2014 and say, well, come on, Russians, living in this authoritarian regime, it's not taken its totalitarian turn yet. What do you make of this Crimea situation? I think 10% of the population would say we're really aggrieved that it's not ours. But 90% of the population would say, yeah, it's Ukrainian. But I mean, that's kind of weird. It's weird. But I mean, whatever. There's lots of stuff that's weird out there. So it's a weirdness that Crimea isn't part of our country. It doesn't make any sense. It's sort of jarring with the imagery that immediately comes to mind when one thinks of Crimea. So I think there would have been 20% of Russians who would have said, bullshit, it's Ukrainian, and forget about this imagery. But that would have still taken some work to, as it were, leverage one's beliefs against one's more imperialistic imagery. And we'll talk about that mechanism actually in detail in the future. What it means to not just give up imperialistic beliefs, but to give up imperialistic imagery. But I think that's the balance. I think the majority would have felt it a bit weird because that kind of cultural myth, the Crimean myth, had a hold over people, but they wouldn't have voted on the basis of it. So it was a potential that Putin tapped into rather than something active. It was active in about 10% of the population. He talked of revolution in the Kremlin in the video, but the revolution from above. But is there no chance of a revolution from below? The big problem is that all the stories and messages that the Russian opposition can come up with at the moment don't, in my opinion, amount to a future vision for Russia. And that's not necessarily a failure of theirs. It is a failure of theirs, but it's not an easy problem to solve. There's a global crisis of vision. Like, what's the vision for American politics? Right? I mean, you're watching this, and if you are in the United States, I bet you can't say. And if you can say, you cannot point to sufficient forces out there in the politics and in the culture to give that a shot of becoming real. So we've got a crisis of visualizing the future concretely and clearly all over the world. It's an even worse crisis of that kind for the Russian opposition. And so what I would say is centrally missing isn't moral authority from folks who are opposing the Putin regime and they're in prison, but a really compelling and actionable, clear picture of the future presented by a leader. So if you abstract away whether this proposal is good or bad, you can say somebody like Lenin. So that's missing. But I think that when we talk about the faults of the Russian opposition, we've got to be really concrete. What's wrong with them? What are they not doing? What did they fail to do well in the past? At the moment, I'm seeing a lot of rather sort of moralized criticism of them that's just lacks concreteness and actually reproduces the same kind of somewhat buffoonish, moral, platitudinous verbiage Russian opposition sometimes come up with. That's the sort of stuff that folks critical of the Russian opposition themselves reproduce. So stuff like, well, if they were any good, why haven't they made a difference and got rid of Putin? Well, that's not a point, right? That's just moralizing or sort of abstract ventilation. Give me the concrete mistakes they made. I think there are those over the last 10 years. Let's analyze them, right? We're going to talk about that too. But the key problem basically is that there's a lack of the coming together of a clear vision of the future with a leader who carries and holds that vision. Lots and lots of love. The microphone was a bit far away from me, so I hope I was audible. If you're watching this in 2023, Happy New Year. If you're watching it before, almost Happy New Year. Lots and lots of love, and I can't wait to be regularly present with you here and on the main channel too over the weeks and months and years, and as long as the time that we have is there. We're gonna be together. We're gonna be engaging, talking, building this community. I'm very grateful to you. Lots of love. Talk soon.